Marry me just for today, please. The words slipped out of Sophie Bennett's mouth before her brain had time to catch up, and for a moment, even she couldn't believe she had said them. The ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, the kind of place where people wore tailored suits and gowns that probably cost more than Sophie made in 3 months working the front desk. A string quartet played softly near the fountain. Waiters carried silver trays of sparkling drinks, and 100 guests laughed and chatted as if the world had never known a bad day. Sophie stood there in borrowed heels that pinched her feet, and a pale blue dress she had found at a thrift shop 2 days earlier, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might echo through the entire room. Behind her, through the tall glass doors leading to the lobby, she could see 2 men she absolutely did not want to talk to scanning the crowd. Her stomach twisted. She didn't have time to think of a better plan. So she grabbed the hand of the first man standing beside her and said the only thing she could think of. The man slowly turned his head toward her. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair neatly combed and the calm kind of presence that made the chaos around him seem quieter. His tailored black suit fit perfectly, and the silver watch on his wrist probably cost more than Sophie's used Honda parked 3 blocks away. His expression was not angry or confused. If anything, it looked mildly curious, as if strangers asking him to become their husband for the afternoon was just another unusual moment in a very long day. Sophie swallowed hard and lowered her voice. I know this sounds crazy, she whispered quickly, glancing again toward the lobby doors. But those guys over there think I owe them money, and if they see me alone, they won't leave me alone. If you just pretend to be my husband for a few minutes, they'll go away. I promise I'll disappear right after. The man followed her nervous glance toward the entrance where the 2 men were now slowly stepping into the ballroom, looking around with suspicious patience. When he looked back at Sophie, something flickered in his eyes that she couldn't quite read, not amusement exactly, but interest. For a second she expected him to laugh or politely walk away. Instead he studied her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Your husband? He repeated calmly. Sophie nodded quickly, her cheeks burning. Just until they leave. 5 minutes. 10 at most. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Without another word, he slipped a simple silver ring from his pocket, turned toward her, and gently placed it into her palm. If we're doing this, he said quietly, we should at least make it believable. Sophie stared at the ring in shock, completely unaware that the man now standing beside her wasn't just another wedding guest in an expensive suit. His name was Lucas Whitmore, and the hotel they were standing in wasn't just hosting the wedding tonight. It belonged to him. For a moment, Sophie could only stare at the small silver ring resting in her palm, while the music from the quartet drifted softly across the ballroom, and the warm glow of the chandeliers reflected across the polished marble floor. Her mind raced. She had expected the stranger to laugh, or at least refuse politely, but instead he had stepped directly into the strange little story she had invented. Sophie forced herself to breathe, and quickly slid the ring onto her finger. It was slightly loose, but under the soft golden lights it looked real enough. The man beside her moved closer and gently placed his arm around her shoulders with the natural ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. From a distance, they probably looked like any other married couple attending the wedding. Relax, he said quietly, his voice calm and steady near her ear. If they believe the story, they will leave. Sophie nodded, trying to steady the nervous rhythm in her chest. She risked another glance toward the ballroom entrance and saw the 2 men slowly scanning the crowd. One of them looked directly toward her. Her heart jumped. Instinctively, she leaned closer to the man beside her, resting her hand lightly against his chest, as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. Thank you, she whispered quickly. I know this is completely ridiculous. The man looked down at her with a faint smile that seemed more curious than amused. People make unusual requests in hotels every day, he replied. This one is simply more creative than most. Sophie almost laughed despite the tension twisting in her stomach. Around them guests continued to mingle, glasses clinked gently, and someone across the room began congratulating the newly married couple. Everything looked perfectly normal, except Sophie could feel the quiet intensity of the stranger standing beside her, as if he was observing the entire room without appearing to try. The 2 men near the entrance finally noticed her. Sophie felt it immediately. One of them nudged the other and pointed subtly in her direction. Her fingers tightened around the sleeve of the man beside her. "They see me," she murmured. The stranger did not look concerned. Instead, he leaned down slightly and spoke with calm confidence. "Then we should act like a married couple." Before Sophie could react, he gently took her hand and lifted it just enough for the silver ring to catch the light of the chandeliers. The gesture was simple, but from across the ballroom it was unmistakable. Sophie followed his lead and smiled nervously, pretending to whisper something into his ear while the two men watched from a distance. After a few seconds, the men exchanged uncertain looks. One of them shrugged. Slowly they turned away and drifted back toward the lobby doors. Sophie held her breath until they disappeared completely into the hallway. The tension in her shoulders finally released. "They are gone," she said softly, almost in disbelief. She stepped back and looked up at the man who had just saved her from the most awkward situation of her life. "I do not know how to thank you." He studied her for a moment, then glanced toward the ballroom doors where the men had vanished. "Actually," he said calmly, "I might have a small request of my own." Sophie blinked in surprise. "A request?" The man nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful as he looked down at the ring on her finger. "Yes," he said, "since we are apparently married tonight, perhaps you would consider staying in the role a little longer." Sophie frowned in confusion. "How much longer?" The man gave a quiet smile that revealed nothing about the truth she had not yet discovered. 30 days, he said. "Let us stay married for 30 days. Sophie stared at him as if she had heard the number wrong. The music in the ballroom continued behind them. Glasses clinked softly, and guests laughed near the dance floor. Yet for Sophie, it suddenly felt as if the entire room had gone quiet. 30 days? She repeated slowly, trying to understand whether the stranger beside her was joking. The man did not laugh. He simply watched her reaction with the same calm curiosity he had shown since the moment she grabbed his hand. Sophie folded her arms lightly across her chest. "You are serious." "Completely," he replied. "But before you refuse, perhaps we should step somewhere quieter." He gestured toward the wide hallway that led out of the ballroom. Sophie hesitated for a moment, glancing once more toward the lobby where the two men had disappeared. They had not returned, but the thought of them wandering somewhere nearby still made her uneasy. With a small sigh, she nodded. "All right, but I still do not understand why you would want something like that." They walked together through the tall doors and into a quieter corridor lined with large framed photographs of the hotel from decades past. The noise of the celebration faded into a distant hum. Sophie suddenly became very aware of how expensive everything around her looked, from the thick carpet under her shoes to the polished brass lamps glowing along the walls. She turned toward him again. "Okay," she said. "Explain." The man leaned casually against the wall, slipping his hands into his pockets as if he had all the time in the world. "For the past several years my life has been very structured," he said slowly. "Meetings, travel, schedules planned months ahead. Every conversation tends to follow the same pattern." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a normal job." "Perhaps," he replied, "but I would like to try something different for a while. Something ordinary." Sophie laughed lightly. "Pretending to be married to a stranger is not exactly ordinary." "Maybe not," he said, smiling slightly. "But you asked me first." Sophie could not argue with that. She studied his face again, searching for any sign that he was making fun of her situation. Instead, she saw only patience and quiet confidence. "Why 30 days?" she asked. "Because a few minutes tonight solved your problem," he answered calmly. "But 30 days could solve several others." Sophie frowned. "What does that mean?" He nodded toward the ring still on her finger. "You said, those men believe you owe them money. If they see you alone again tomorrow, they might start asking questions. But if you appear to have a husband, especially one who seems reliable, they will likely lose interest." Sophie considered that. The logic made uncomfortable sense. "And what do you get out of this?" she asked. The man paused for a moment before answering. "A chance to live quietly for a while without anyone asking who I am or what I do." Sophie tilted her head. "You act like you are famous or something." The man gave a small, amused smile. "Something like that." She looked down at the ring again, turning it slowly around her finger as she thought. 30 days pretending to be married sounded ridiculous, but it might actually give her enough time to fix the financial mess she had been struggling with for months. Finally, she looked back up at him. "Let me get this straight," she said carefully. "We pretend to be married for 30 days. After that, we both walk away like nothing happened. Exactly, he said. Sophie let out a slow breath. And during those 30 days? The man straightened slightly and extended his hand toward her again, just as he had in the ballroom earlier. During those 30 days, he said calmly, we see how convincing we can be. Sophie hesitated only a second before shaking his hand, still unaware that the man standing in front of her was the owner of the entire hotel where their strange agreement had just begun. Sophie did not sleep much that night. After leaving the hotel ballroom, she had walked nearly 8 blocks back to her small apartment, the cool Chicago air brushing against her face while the strange conversation replayed in her mind again and again. 30 days. Pretending to be married to a man she had met less than an hour earlier. It sounded like something from a television drama, not real life. Yet the silver ring was still on her finger, catching the faint light from the street lamps each time she moved her hand. Her apartment building stood on a quiet side street between a grocery store and a laundromat, the kind of place where the hallway lights flickered slightly and the elevator sometimes took 2 tries before the doors closed properly. Sophie pushed open the door to her unit on the 3rd floor and stepped inside. The apartment was small but tidy. A narrow couch sat against one wall, a round kitchen table stood near the window, and a few potted plants rested along the sill where the morning sunlight usually came through. She dropped her purse onto the table and let out a long breath. 30 days, she murmured to herself. The next morning the sound of traffic drifting through the window woke her earlier than usual. Sophie sat up on the couch, still wearing the loose sweater she had changed into the night before. For a moment, she wondered if the entire situation had been a strange dream. Then she saw the ring again. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message appeared from an unknown number. Good morning. This is Lucas. I hope you slept well. Sophie stared at the screen. She had almost forgotten that he had given her his number before they parted outside the hotel entrance. Another message appeared a second later. If our agreement is going to look convincing, we should probably meet today and discuss the details. Sophie rubbed her eyes and typed back slowly. What kind of details? The reply came quickly. Where we live, how we met, the usual things people ask married couples. Sophie could not help smiling a little at that. She stood and walked toward the kitchen window, looking down at the street 3 floors below, where people were already heading to work with coffee cups in their hands. A third message appeared. Also, I believe you mentioned you work at the front desk of the Whitmore Grand. Sophie blinked. That detail had slipped out during their short conversation in the hallway. Yes, she typed. That is my job. Another pause. Then his response appeared. Perfect. I will meet you there in 1 hour. Sophie lowered the phone slowly, confused. Why would he want to meet at her workplace when they could easily talk somewhere quieter? Exactly 1 hour later, Sophie stepped behind the polished marble counter of the Whitmore Grand Hotel lobby, tying her hair neatly back as she prepared for the morning shift. Guests moved through the lobby, pulling rolling suitcases. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the cafe near the entrance, and sunlight poured through the tall glass windows facing the street. Sophie had just begun organizing the reservation cards when the large glass doors opened. A sleek black car stopped outside, and a driver stepped forward to open the rear door. Sophie looked up casually, expecting another guest arriving early for check-in. Instead, she saw Lucas step out of the car with calm confidence, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that looked even more impressive in daylight. Several hotel employees nearby straightened immediately the moment they saw him. One of the managers nearly rushed across the lobby. Sophie frowned slightly, watching the strange reaction ripple through the staff. Lucas walked directly toward the front desk with the same relaxed expression he had worn the night before. Sophie leaned forward slightly across the counter and lowered her voice. You did not tell me you arrived in style, she whispered. Lucas smiled faintly. I thought you might notice eventually. Sophie opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but before she could speak, the hotel manager hurried over beside her and said nervously, Mr. Whitmore, we were not expecting you this morning. Sophie froze. The name echoed in her mind as if someone had suddenly turned up the volume in the room. Slowly she turned her head and looked at the man standing across the counter. Lucas Whitmore, the owner of the entire hotel. Sophie felt the air leave her lungs as if the entire lobby had suddenly grown heavier. Lucas Whitmore. The name repeated in her mind while the hotel manager beside her stood straighter than she had ever seen him stand before. Guests continued walking through the bright marble lobby, rolling their suitcases across the polished floor, completely unaware that Sophie Bennett had just discovered the man she agreed to pretend to marry for 30 days was the billionaire owner of the entire building where she worked. Sophie slowly looked back at Lucas, searching his face for some sign that the manager had made a mistake, but Lucas simply offered the same calm expression he always seemed to wear. "Good morning, Daniel," Lucas said politely to the manager. "I decided to stop by without announcing it." The manager nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Is there anything you need prepared for your visit?" Lucas glanced briefly toward Sophie before answering. "No, I only came to speak with someone." Sophie felt her heartbeat rising again. The manager followed Lucas's glance and then looked at Sophie with sudden confusion. "Miss Bennett?" he asked carefully. Sophie tried to respond, but her voice refused to cooperate for a second. "Yes," she managed. I am here." Lucas gave a small, reassuring smile. "Would you mind taking a short break from the desk?" he asked her calmly. The manager immediately stepped back as if the request had already been approved. "Of course she can," he said quickly. "Take as much time as you need." Sophie walked around the front desk slowly, still trying to process what had just happened. A few employees nearby whispered quietly to each other while watching Lucas with respectful attention. Sophie had worked in this hotel for nearly 2 years, and the owner's name had appeared on documents and corporate emails many times, but she had never once seen his face in person. And now somehow she had accidentally asked him to pretend to be her husband. Lucas gestured toward a quieter seating area near the tall windows where comfortable chairs overlooked the busy street outside. They sat across from each other while morning sunlight poured across the glass table between them. Sophie finally crossed her arms and stared at him. "You are the owner," she said slowly, as if the words still felt strange in her mouth. Lucas nodded once. "Yes." Sophie leaned back in the chair and laughed in disbelief. "And you did not think that information might have been useful yesterday?" Lucas tilted his head slightly. "You did not ask." Sophie rubbed her forehead. "I thought you were just a guest at the wedding." "Technically I was," he replied calmly. "The couple happens to be longtime friends." Sophie looked down at the ring still on her finger and shook her head. "This changes things." Lucas watched her quietly. "Does it?" Sophie pointed toward the lobby where employees continued moving nervously whenever Lucas walked past. "You are a billionaire. I am a front desk clerk who lives in a 500 square foot apartment and takes the bus to work. That is not exactly the same world." Lucas leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "That difference is exactly why the agreement still interests me." Sophie frowned. "You are serious about the 30 days?" Lucas nodded again. "Very." Sophie studied his face carefully. "So you want to pretend to live like an ordinary husband with someone who does not belong in your world?" Lucas gave a quiet smile. "I believe you belong just fine." Sophie looked toward the lobby again, then back at him, still trying to decide whether the situation was completely insane or strangely possible. "If we do this," she said slowly, "there will have to be rules." Lucas raised an eyebrow with interest. "Rules?" Sophie nodded firmly. "Yes, because if I am going to pretend to be married to a billionaire for 30 days, we are definitely going to need rules." Sophie folded her arms and looked directly at Lucas as morning sunlight poured through the tall lobby windows behind him. The city outside was already busy, yellow taxis moving slowly through traffic, while people hurried along the sidewalks with coffee cups in their hands. Inside the hotel, everything looked calm and polished, but Sophie felt like her entire reality had just tilted sideways. Pretending to be married to a stranger had sounded strange enough the night before. Pretending to be married to a billionaire was something else entirely. Lucas watched her patiently, clearly waiting to hear the rules she had mentioned. Sophie lifted one finger. "First rule," she said firmly. "No treating me like some project or experiment. I am a real person with a real job." Lucas nodded without hesitation. "Fair." She raised a second finger. "Second rule. My life does not suddenly become luxury and private jets just because you are rich. I still live in my apartment. I still work my normal shift here." Lucas leaned back slightly in his chair, considering that for a moment before nodding again. "I expected that." Sophie narrowed her eyes slightly. "Did you?" Lucas smiled faintly. "Yes. It is one of the reasons I asked for 30 days. Sophie continued before he could add anything else. "Third rule," she said. "No lying to me again about something this big. If we are pretending to be married, I at least deserve the truth when I ask a question." Lucas rested his hands calmly on the table. That is reasonable. Sophie lowered her hand slowly, then looked down at the silver ring on her finger again. It still felt strange seeing it there. And the last rule, she added quietly. After 30 days, everything ends exactly as we agreed. No surprises. Lucas studied her expression carefully, as if weighing every word she had just said. Agreed, he replied. Sophie let out a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding. For a moment neither of them spoke, while the quiet sound of lobby conversations drifted across the room. Finally Lucas reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a small folded document on the table. Sophie frowned. What is that? Lucas pushed it gently toward her. A simple agreement. Nothing complicated. Just something confirming the timeline and the arrangement so that everything stays clear. Sophie opened the paper and scanned the page. It was only one sheet long, written in calm, straightforward language that confirmed their plan to present themselves publicly as a married couple for 30 days. At the bottom was a space for 2 signatures. Sophie looked up at him again. You really planned this. Lucas shrugged lightly. I tend to prepare for unusual situations. Sophie laughed quietly despite herself. That must happen often for you. Lucas did not answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the front entrance of the hotel, where guests continued arriving with luggage carts rolling behind them. Not quite like this, he said. Sophie tapped the paper with her finger. And what exactly happens during these 30 days? Lucas met her eyes again with calm confidence. We live normally. We let people believe we are married. We see what happens. Sophie tilted her head. That sounds incredibly vague. Lucas smiled slightly. Life usually is. Sophie read the agreement one more time before picking up the pen resting beside the paper. She hesitated for only a second, then signed her name carefully on the line. Lucas took the pen next and added his signature beneath hers. When he finished, he folded the paper and placed it back into his pocket. Sophie looked at him again, still half amazed by the situation. So that is it, she said slowly. For the next 30 days we are husband and wife. Lucas stood from his chair and offered his hand to help her up. Yes, he said calmly. And we should probably start by making it look convincing. Sophie stood beside Lucas in the bright hotel lobby, still adjusting to the strange reality that had unfolded within the last 24 hours. Just yesterday, she had been a front desk employee worried about overdue bills and 2 persistent men asking for money she did not have. Now she was standing next to the billionaire owner of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, while wearing a silver ring that suggested she was his wife. Lucas glanced toward the reception desk where several employees were quietly watching them with careful curiosity. If we are going to make this convincing, he said calmly, people here will need to believe it first. Sophie followed his gaze and noticed the subtle whispers already spreading between the concierge and the Bell staff. You mean your employees, she said quietly. My co-workers. Lucas nodded. Exactly. Sophie exhaled slowly. This is going to be awkward. Lucas gave a small smile. Probably. Before Sophie could say anything else, the same manager from earlier approached them again, still carrying the polite but nervous posture he had shown when Lucas arrived. Mr. Whitmore, the manager said carefully, the executive team has asked if you would like the conference suite prepared for a meeting. Lucas shook his head gently. That will not be necessary today, Daniel. The manager nodded but remained standing there for a moment as his eyes moved curiously between Lucas and Sophie. Lucas seemed to notice the hesitation. Without warning, he placed a calm hand lightly on Sophie's shoulder. Actually, Lucas said, there is something I should mention. Sophie felt the sudden warmth of his hand and tried not to react. Lucas looked directly at the manager. This is Sophie Bennett, he continued. My wife. For half a second the words hung in the air like a quiet echo. Daniel blinked. Sophie blinked. Even the concierge behind the desk froze in the middle of sorting reservation cards. The manager recovered first. Your wife? He repeated, clearly trying to process the information while maintaining professional composure. Lucas nodded calmly as if the announcement were the most natural thing in the world. We married recently, he said. Sophie felt her heartbeat climb again, but forced herself to play along. She slipped her hand gently through Lucas's arm and gave a small polite smile. Hello, Daniel, she said, hoping her voice sounded steady. The manager quickly straightened. Of course. Congratulations to both of you. Sophie could practically feel the ripple of surprise moving across the lobby staff behind the counter. Lucas gave a short nod. Thank you. Daniel excused himself and walked quickly back toward the reception area, clearly eager to share the news he had just heard. Sophie waited until he was out of earshot before turning to Lucas with wide eyes. You did not warn me you were going to say that. Lucas looked mildly amused. It seemed like the simplest explanation. Sophie lowered her voice. The entire hotel staff is going to talk about this for the next year. Lucas glanced toward the front doors where sunlight spilled across the marble floor. Then the story will spread quickly, he said, which helps make our arrangement believable. Sophie sighed and shook her head. You really think this through? Lucas looked down briefly at the ring on her finger, then back at her face. Not everything, he said quietly. Sophie followed his glance and noticed again how natural the ring looked on her hand. For a moment, she wondered how many strangers in the lobby already believed the story Lucas had just told. She crossed her arms again. So what now? Lucas checked the time on his watch. Now, he said calmly. A married couple should probably decide where they are going to live. Sophie blinked. You mean during the 30 days? Lucas nodded. Exactly. Sophie let out a quiet laugh. Well, that is easy, she said. We live in my apartment. Lucas raised an eyebrow with interest. Your 500-square-foot apartment. Sophie smiled confidently. Yes, she replied. Welcome to normal life. Sophie did not realize how quiet Lucas had become until they were sitting side by side in the back seat of a simple rideshare car, heading toward her neighborhood. Outside the window, the skyline of downtown Chicago slowly faded behind them as the streets grew narrower and the buildings older. Lucas watched everything carefully, the small grocery stores on the corners, the bus stops where people waited in jackets against the wind, the rows of brick apartment buildings that looked nothing like the luxury towers near the river. Sophie noticed his silence and crossed her arms with a teasing smile. What happened? She asked. The billionaire is having second thoughts about living in a 500-square-foot apartment. Lucas shook his head calmly. Not at all. I am simply observing. Sophie laughed softly. Observing what? Lucas looked out the window again as the car turned onto her street. Your world. 10 minutes later, the car stopped beside the familiar brick building Sophie had called home for the last 2 years. The hallway lights inside flickered slightly as they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor because the elevator had once again decided not to work. Lucas carried his own small travel bag without complaint while Sophie unlocked the door to apartment 3B. She stepped inside first and flipped on the light. Welcome to the Bennett residence, she said with playful drama. Lucas followed her inside and paused just past the doorway. The apartment was exactly what she had described earlier. A small living room with a worn but comfortable couch, a narrow kitchen barely wide enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time, and a window that looked out toward the laundromat sign glowing across the street. A small wooden table held 2 mismatched chairs, and several potted plants rested along the windowsill. Sophie placed her purse on the table and turned toward him. Well, she asked. It is not exactly one of your penthouses. Lucas slowly set his bag beside the couch. His eyes moved quietly around the room before settling back on her. It is honest, he said. Sophie tilted her head. Honest. Lucas nodded. Nothing here is pretending to be something else. Sophie smiled faintly at that answer. She walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator before speaking again. I hope you like normal food, she called out. Because the fanciest thing I have in here is frozen pizza. Lucas stepped closer to the counter, watching her pull the box from the freezer. That sounds perfectly acceptable. Sophie placed the pizza on the counter and looked at him again. Just so you know, she added, there is only 1 bedroom. Lucas nodded as if that detail had already crossed his mind. Then I will take the couch. Sophie raised an eyebrow in surprise. You did not even argue. Lucas shrugged lightly. You made the rules. Sophie placed the pizza in the oven and leaned against the counter while the warm smell of baking dough slowly filled the apartment. For the first time that day, everything felt strangely normal. No marble lobby. No nervous employees whispering. Just a small apartment, an old couch, and a billionaire quietly adjusting to a life he had never lived before. After a few minutes, Sophie spoke again, her voice softer now. You know, she said, most people would probably think this situation is completely insane. Lucas leaned against the wall beside the window and looked at the silver ring still resting on her finger. They might. He replied calmly. Sophie followed his gaze and turned the ring slowly around her hand. But for some reason, she said quietly. It also feels a little exciting. Lucas smiled faintly. That is usually how unusual stories begin. Outside the window, the city lights flickered on as evening settled across the street. And inside the small apartment, the quiet agreement they had signed that morning had officially begun to feel real. The smell of warm pizza filled the small apartment, while the city outside slowly quieted into the calm rhythm of evening traffic. Sophie slid 2 plates onto the tiny wooden table while Lucas sat across from her, looking slightly amused as he studied the simple dinner in front of him. Be honest, Sophie said while handing him a slice. This is probably the least expensive meal you have had in years. Lucas accepted the plate without hesitation. It might be, he said calmly, but it smells good. Sophie laughed softly and sat down across from him. For a few minutes, they simply ate and listened to the distant sound of cars passing outside the window. The situation still felt surreal to her. 24 hours ago, she had been worrying about overdue rent and how to avoid 2 men who believed she owed them money. Now the billionaire owner of the hotel where she worked was sitting at her tiny kitchen table eating frozen pizza like it was the most normal evening in the world. Lucas finished his slice and looked around the apartment again. How long have you lived here? He asked. Sophie leaned back in her chair. 2 years, she said. It is small, but it is mine. Lucas nodded slowly. And those men from yesterday? Sophie sighed quietly. They think I owe them for helping me cover a medical bill for my younger brother last year, she explained. It started as a favor, but the payments kept growing. Lucas listened carefully without interrupting. Sophie continued. They are not terrible people, she said honestly. Just persistent. If they think I suddenly have a husband, they will probably stop asking questions. Lucas glanced toward the ring on her finger again. Then the story is already helping. Sophie followed his gaze and turned the ring once more around her hand. It had only been there for a day, yet somehow it already felt strangely natural. She looked back at him with curiosity. Can I ask you something? Lucas nodded. Of course. Sophie studied his expression carefully. Why did you really agree to this? You could have helped me yesterday without pretending to be married for a month. Lucas was quiet for a moment before answering. Because helping someone for a moment is easy, he said calmly. Living beside someone for 30 days shows who they really are. Sophie tilted her head slightly. So this is some kind of experiment for you. Lucas shook his head. Not exactly. More like a chance to see life from a different side. Sophie considered that answer while the soft light from the kitchen lamp reflected across the small table. Finally, she smiled faintly. Well, she said, welcome to the different side. Lucas returned the smile, his expression thoughtful but relaxed. Outside the apartment window, the laundromat sign flickered quietly, casting blue light across the glass. Inside the small room, the strange agreement between a billionaire and a front desk clerk had officially turned into something real. Sophie gathered the empty plates and placed them in the sink before turning back toward the table. Lucas was still sitting there, looking around the apartment as if memorizing every small detail. You know, Sophie said with a quiet laugh, most people would never believe this story. Lucas looked up at her. Perhaps not, he said. Sophie leaned against the counter, folding her arms again. But for the next 30 days, she added, lifting her hand slightly, so the silver ring caught the warm kitchen light. I guess we are going to find out exactly how believable it can be.